this is Ed Chapman, and this videocast is part 4 in a series on cellular respiration. And in this videocast, we're going to focus on the citric acid cycle, otherwise known as the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, and how both of these processes, or these metabolic pathways, produce most of the ATPs that cells are getting out of the foods, especially glucose and fatty acids that they're processing. Now, just quickly to review here, glucose is the molecule we're starting with. Glucose is a 6-carbon carbohydrate. It gets processed through the metabolic pathway that we call glycolysis. Glycolysis is not aerobic at all. It doesn't require any oxygen. It takes place in the cytoplasm of all cells. And in the process, glucose is broken down into something called pyruvate. Now, pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule. So if you start with 6 and you end up with 3, there's actually 2 of them. So you get 2 pyruvates out of this. Now, glycolysis has a payoff. The cell is able to extract 2 ATPs from this and 2 filled electron carriers, so 2 NADH molecules are produced. Now, what's going to happen is this pyruvate is going to be imported into the mitochondria, where it's going to be processed by the citric acid cycle. All right. Now, the complication here is the citric acid cycle doesn't use pyruvate directly. Pyruvate gets converted to another molecule called acetyl-CoA. The CoA stands for a coenzyme that is a reactant in this product, in this process rather. So let's look at what we're talking about here. Here is pyruvate, and sometimes I think it's good to stop and go back and look at some structural formulas here. Pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule, 1, 2, 3. It's also got some oxygens and some hydrogens. It's going to be processed by some enzymes into something called acetyl-CoA. So here is acetyl-CoA over here. And you'll notice acetyl-CoA only has 2 carbons. So that means one must have come out, and here it is. So the conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA is a little bit of a breakdown here. A little bit of carbon dioxide is produced, and you get some NADH made by this. So if you do this for each pyruvate, you can now see where the 2 NADHs are coming from. All right, now, what this means is, if you look at a mitochondrion close-up, there's actually an outer membrane, out here on the outside, an inner membrane, which is folded, and on the inside of the inner membrane, there's an area in here, a space, called the matrix. Now the matrix is where the citric acid cycle happens. So if you think of a citric acid cycle as a cycle, no beginning and no end, these citric acid pathways are happening in the matrix of the mitochondria. And acetyl-CoA, which we've just made, is what's being imported into the matrix, and it's feeding into the citric acid cycles. So let's look at that. Now, don't let this diagram scare you. All I want you to see when you look at this is that it's a loop. It's a cycle. It has no beginning and no end. Here is the acetyl-CoA, which is going into the cycle, and it's being processed. And as the cycle turns and works on acetyl-CoA, it is releasing NADHs, ATPs, and another electron carrier called FADH2. Pretty much the same thing as NADH. And in the process, it's spitting out carbon dioxides. So here's the one that came out when we changed pyruvate into acetyl-CoA. So that's one of them. Here's another one that comes out, and 3. So for each pyruvate going in, we have 3 carbon dioxides being produced. So all 3 of these carbons are now accounted for. And the leftovers, which is a 4-carbon molecule here, is combining with acetyl-CoA, which is a 2-carbon molecule, to produce citric acid, which is a 6-carbon molecule. That's why they call this the citric acid cycle, because citric acid is the first product in the metabolic pathway that we call the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle. All right. So the total products, or just to kind of add this all up, acetyl-CoA is going in, and what is coming out of the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, is carbon dioxide, NADH, and FADH2. Remember that. That's important. Now remember, the NADH, which is carrying electrons, the whole reason for this molecule's existence is for it to be fed into the electron transport chain, or the ETC. And the reason why this electron transport chain exists is to take these electrons from NADH and FADH2, and as they fall downhill through this series of membrane-bound proteins, ADP is being converted to ATP. And this is where most of the ATP molecules are coming from aerobic respiration. Now, of course, these electrons have to be pulled downhill or encouraged to move through this process, and that pull, that energy is happening because of oxygen down here. Remember, oxygen very much wants to combine with things. It's a powerful oxidizer, and so each O2 molecule, or each oxygen, so it's like a half of an O2, is combining with some electrons and some free hydrogen ions to produce water as a side effect or a waste product here. Okay, so as long as there's oxygen present, right here, this pathway, the electron transport chain, can extract electrons from NADH, oxidize NADH, and reduce oxygen to produce water. And the process gives us the ATP that everybody needs and every cell wants. All right. So the fact that there's oxygen right here is why we have the need for oxygen. It's aerobic. Okay. This is where the word aerobic comes from. Oxygen is required for the ETC. All right. So let's summarize this. Put it all together. You've seen this reaction before. Sugar, glucose plus oxygen gives you carbon dioxide, water, and some energy. All right, look at it in a little bit more detail. The sugar, the glucose, goes into glycolysis, gets converted to pyruvate. The oxygen goes into the electron transport chain. Remember, it's at the bottom of the chain, sucking up those electrons. Okay, the carbon dioxides are coming out of the citric acid cycle. Energy is coming out in the form of ATP molecules from the electron transport chain, the citric acid cycle, and glycolysis. All three of them produce some ATPs. Okay, and we get some water molecules also being produced by the electron transport chain. It's what you get when the oxygen combines with the hydrogen ions and the electrons. So I'm hoping now that you can connect this equation to the metabolic pathways that we just talked about. All right, and remember, the most important fact, I think, from respiration is aerobic respiration gives you 38 ATPs from each glucose. All right, so the ATPs you get from this, that's the biggest payoff possible from metabolism processing foods to make us ATP energy. All right, now there's another way of processing pyruvate without oxygen, and that is called anaerobic or fermentation. But that's a different process, and we're going to save that for a different video cast. Thanks for listening.